The wind howled across the frozen expanse, sharp as a blade against my exposed skin. The storm had arrived faster than predicted, thick sheets of snow swallowing the landscape in an endless white void. My thermal suit barely held up against the relentless cold, and my body ached with exhaustion. Each step was a battle, my boots crunching against ice-covered ground as I struggled forward. The locator beacon on my wrist blinked weakly, signaling distress, but the storm's interference made it useless. I was alone. I hadn't meant to stray this far. The research team had set up camp miles away, near the designated safe zone, but my drone malfunctioned mid-flight, leading me off course. When I went to retrieve it, the storm had already begun to roll in. By the time I realized my mistake, the landscape had transformed into a blinding blizzard, and all sense of direction had vanished. My breath came in ragged gasps, fogging against my visor. I wiped a gloved hand across it, trying to clear my vision. The wind stole the heat from my body, creeping into the seams of my suit despite its advanced insulation. My fingers were numb, my thoughts sluggish. If I didn't find shelter soon, I wouldn't last the hour. Then I saw her, a figure, barely visible through the snow, wrapped in thick, fur-lined garments that clung to her form. She stood motionless, watching me. The firelight from a torch in her hand flickered against the white surroundings, illuminating silver-blue skin and dark, piercing eyes. I stopped, my breath catching. The Nivari. I had read reports about them, nomadic beings native to this frozen wasteland, elusive and territorial. No human had ever made meaningful contact with one, not beyond distant glimpses and abandoned dwellings found half buried in ice. They were a mystery, a myth to some. Yet she was here, and she was beckoning me forward. For a long moment I hesitated. Was this a trick? A trap? Or was it the only chance I had at survival? The cold made the decision for me. My body was failing, muscles locking up. If I stood here any longer, I'd collapse where I stood. I took a step toward her. Then another. She turned and disappeared into the storm. I had no choice but to follow. The wind roared around me as I trudged after her, my boots sinking into the deep snow with each step. She moved effortlessly, her form barely shifting the drifts, as if she had lived in this frozen hell's cape her entire life, which, of course, she had. I struggled to keep up, pushing forward with what little strength I had left. Then, suddenly, the ground beneath my feet became solid. The wind lessened. The air, though still frigid, felt marginally warmer. We had entered a shelter. The hut was built into the side of a jagged rock formation, its walls made from carved stone and reinforced with the bones of massive creatures I didn't recognize. The entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for me to squeeze through. Once inside, I staggered, my legs barely able to support me. The interior was dimly lit, a fire pit at the center casting flickering light across the walls. The space was small but functional, lined with shelves made from hardened ice and furs draped along the walls. The air smelled of burning wood and something else, earthy, slightly spicy. A pot hung over the fire, its contents bubbling softly. Alari pulled back her hood, revealing delicate yet striking features. High cheekbones, dark markings that ran from her temples down to her collarbone, and hair like midnight snow, loosely braided down her back. Her eyes, an unnatural shade of violet, studied me with quiet intensity. I exhaled, my breath visible in the still cool air. My limbs trembled from exhaustion and cold, but the fire's warmth was already starting to seep into my frozen skin. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, she broke the silence. "You should not be here." Her voice was melodic but held an edge, her grasp of my language rough as if it had been learned long ago and seldom used. I managed a weak chuckle, rubbing my hands together near the fire. "Yeah, you could say that." She crouched across from me, tilting her head in that distinctly inhuman way. "You are lost." I nodded. "Got caught in the storm. My equipment failed." She observed me for a long moment, as if weighing my words. Then, without another word, she reached for a wooden bowl and dipped it into the pot over the fire. Steam curled from the dark liquid as she handed it to me. I hesitated. Trusting an unknown alien in the middle of a frozen wasteland wasn't exactly wise. But my body ached, and my insides felt like ice. The warmth of the bowl alone sent a pleasant tingling through my numb fingers. I took a cautious sip. The heat spread through me instantly, chasing away the cold that had settled deep in my bones. The taste was unfamiliar, rich with spices I couldn't name, but it was good, comforting. She watched me closely, amusement flickering in her violet eyes. Better, I exhaled, nodding. Yeah, thanks. She sat back on her heels, still studying me as if I were some strange creature that had wandered into her home uninvited. After a moment, she spoke again. You are not like the others. A frown tugged at my brow. Others. Her expression didn't change. The ones who came before. They did not stay. I set the bowl down, something uneasy settling in my stomach. What happened to them? She didn't answer. Instead, she rose to her feet and crossed the small space between us. Too close. Close enough that I could see the subtle glow of her markings in the firelight, could feel the heat of her body even through my suit. Her fingers reached out, brushing against my jawline with a touch so light it sent a shiver down my spine. You are warm, she murmured, tilting her head as if this realization intrigued her. I swallowed hard. Yeah, I guess so. Her gaze flickered, intense and unreadable. Her fingers traced down, lingering at the edge of my collar. There was no mistaking the shift in the air. This wasn't just curiosity. It was something else entirely. Ilari wasn't as innocent as she looked. The fire burned low, casting long shadows along the stone walls. The storm still raged outside, howling like some ancient beast clawing at the shelter. But inside, the air was warm, thick with something unspoken. Ilari sat across from me, legs folded beneath her, fingers idly tracing the rim of the empty wooden bowl I had handed back moments before. Her violet eyes remained fixed on me, unblinking, studying. She had barely spoken since I finished the drink, but the silence between us was heavy, not awkward, something else entirely. Something that sent a slow warmth creeping beneath my skin, different from the fire's heat. Finally, I spoke. You never told me why you helped me. She tilted her head, a small, barely perceptible smile flickering across her lips before disappearing just as quickly. You were dying. Simple, matter of fact. But there was something in the way she said it that made me wonder if there was more. I leaned back against the furs piled behind me, the exhaustion of the day finally catching up to me. You didn't have to. Her gaze flickered, something unreadable passing through it. I chose to. The way she said it, slow and deliberate, sent a strange shiver down my spine. I watched as she stood, moving fluidly across the room. She pulled aside a heavy fur curtain at the back of the hut, revealing another smaller space beyond. A sleeping area, lined with thick pelts. The flickering firelight barely reached past the entrance, leaving most of it in shadow. She turned back to me, one hand resting against the frame of the opening. You should rest. I hesitated, glancing around. Where will you sleep? Her lips quirked again, and she took a slow step toward me. Here. The answer shouldn't have surprised me, but something about the way she said it sent my pulse quickening. She crossed the space between us effortlessly, lowering herself onto the furs beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. I swallowed. You don't mind sharing? She studied me for a long moment, then reached out, her fingertips barely grazing the back of my hand. Do you? A test. A challenge. An invitation. I had 100 reasons to pull away. She wasn't human. I didn't know her people, didn't know if this was some kind of cultural misunderstanding or something deeper, something I wasn't prepared for. But none of those reasons made me move. Instead, I stayed. The moment stretched between us, neither of us speaking, the fire crackling softly in the silence. Her fingers drifted higher, tracing along my wrist, exploring the texture of my skin as if it fascinated her. Her touch was light, barely there, but it sent a slow-burning heat curling through my veins. She exhaled softly. Your kind does not stay. It wasn't a question. I turned to her, our faces inches apart. "Do you want me to leave?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she lifted my hand, pressing it against her chest, right over the slow, steady rhythm of her heartbeat. It was faster than a human's, lighter, but still strong beneath my palm. "You are different," she murmured. I didn't know if she meant that in a good way or a bad one. But before I could ask, she leaned in. The kiss was slow, deliberate, an exploration more than an act of passion. Her lips were soft, warm, unfamiliar. Her fingers curled into the fabric of my sleeve, pulling me closer, and I let her, my body moving without thought, without hesitation. For a moment, the storm outside didn't exist. The cold, the danger, the distance between our worlds. None of it mattered. There was only this, her. When she finally pulled back, her breath was uneven, her gaze searching. "Stay." A plea. A demand. Promise. I didn't answer right away, but I knew the truth the moment she said it. I wasn't going anywhere. The days blurred together in the warmth of Alari's hut, the storm outside refusing to break. It howled like a living thing, an angry force that demanded submission. But inside, the fire never dimmed. I found myself adjusting to the rhythm of this secluded world, learning the ways of survival through her. She showed me how to layer the furs properly to keep the heat trapped against my skin, how to sense when the winds would shift before the worst of the cold settled in. She taught me which dried roots and herbs to chew to keep strength in my limbs, and how to recognize the distant calls of creatures that lurked beyond the veil of snow. I listened, learned, but more than that, I watched her. Everything she did was with a precise, quiet grace. Even in stillness, there was an intensity about her, as if she were always waiting, always aware. When she moved, it was deliberate, each step calculated but effortless. She had lived in this frozen world all her life, and it showed in the way she never seemed to shiver, never faltered against the cold. But sometimes, in the evenings, when the fire burned low and the wind outside was just a whisper against the stone walls, she let herself soften. She would sit beside me, her long fingers tracing idle patterns against my arm, my shoulder, my chest, learning the shape of me, as if committing every inch to memory. I never stopped her. Her touch was cautious at first, filled with curiosity more than anything. But as the nights stretched on, something changed. The hesitance faded, replaced by something deeper, something unspoken. One evening, as I sat sharpening the small blade she had given me, I felt her behind me before she spoke. "You have adjusted quickly." I turned slightly, meeting her gaze over my shoulder. "You're a good teacher." She tilted her head, considering me. "No," she said after a moment, stepping closer. "It is not that." She crouched beside me, one hand resting lightly on my knee, her fingers warm even through the thick fabric. The weight of her touch sent a quiet thrill through me, but I didn't move. She watched me for a long moment, then reached for my hand, turning it over so my palm faced up. Her fingertips brushed across the lines there, tracing them with an almost reverent focus. "You are not like them," she murmured. I exhaled. "You keep saying that." Her violet eyes flickered up to mine, and the firelight caught the gold flecks buried within their depths. "Because it is true." She lifted my hand, pressing it to the side of her neck. Her skin was warm, impossibly smooth, and I could feel the steady pulse beneath my fingertips. I swallowed. "Alari." Her other hand curled around my wrist, holding me in place. "You do not fear me." It wasn't a question. I shook my head. "No." Something flickered across her expression. Satisfaction, maybe, or something even deeper. Her grip tightened slightly before she released me, but she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned in. Her lips brushed against mine, light at first, hesitant. But when I responded, when I reached for her, she let herself press closer, her fingers threading into my hair, her body warm against mine. The kiss deepened, slow but certain, like the steady thaw of ice in spring. There was no rush, no desperation, only the quiet understanding that this was inevitable, that we had been moving toward this moment since the night she found me in the storm. Her hands traced down my arms, over my chest, exploring with a mix of curiosity and intent. She wasn't shy about touching me anymore. She wanted to learn me, and I wanted to let her. I pulled her against me fully, feeling the way she molded to my shape, how perfectly she fit. She made a soft sound against my mouth, her fingers curling into my shoulders. The fire crackled beside us, heat filling the space between our bodies. She wasn't as innocent as she looked, and I wasn't about to stop her. The storm finally broke. After what felt like an eternity of howling winds and blinding snow, the skies cleared, revealing a pale sun hanging over an endless white expanse. The silence outside was eerie at first, as if the world itself had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment. Inside the hut, the fire still burned, but something between us had shifted. Alari sat near the entrance, wrapped in thick furs, her gaze distant as she stared out at the icy wasteland beyond. She had been quiet since dawn, her usual intensity dulled by something else, something I couldn't quite place. I stood, crossing the small space between us. "You're thinking about something." She didn't turn, but I saw the way her fingers tightened around the fabric of her cloak. "The storm is over," I exhaled, rubbing a hand over my face. "Yeah, it is." The unspoken words hung between us. I could leave now. I should leave now. My team was out there, likely searching for me. The locator beacon on my wrist had started working again with the clearing skies, blinking steadily like a distant heartbeat. A single press and they would know I was alive. They would come for me. But I didn't move. Alari finally turned to face me, her violet eyes unreadable. "You will go back to them." It wasn't a question. I swallowed hard, unsure of how to answer. She reached out, her fingers brushing over the beacon on my wrist before she pulled away. "Your kind does not stay." I flinched at the words, at the quiet resignation in them. "You think I want to leave?" Her gaze flickered. "It does not matter what you want." I grabbed her hand before she could pull away completely. "Yes, it does." She stilled. The silence between us was heavier than the storm had ever been. I took a breath. "I don't know what happens next," I admitted. "I don't know how this works, how we—" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "But I know I don't want to leave you." Her fingers tightened around mine. For the first time since I met her, Ilari looked uncertain. Not in the way of someone who was afraid, but in the way of someone who had never dared to hope. "You would choose this?" she asked softly. I looked around the small hut, at the fire that had kept me warm, at the walls that had protected me, at the place that had somehow become more of a home than anywhere else ever had. Then I looked at her. "I choose you," she exhaled, a breath that almost sounded like relief. Then, without warning, she reached for my wrist again. But this time, instead of touching the beacon, she lifted it carefully, unfastening the strap. I didn't stop her. She held it for a moment, then stood, walking to the fire. Without hesitation, she tossed it into the flames. The metal hissed, the small blinking light flickering out. The choice had been made. Ilari turned back to me, her expression unreadable for a long moment. Then she smiled. It was small, subtle, but real. She reached for my hand again, lacing her fingers through mine. Outside, the ice stretched on forever. The storm had passed, but I wasn't lost anymore. I was home,